When we speak about the possibility of a global conflict, we must begin with a reality that is unfolding right before our eyes: the steady rise of tensions between the world's most powerful nations. History has shown us that world wars rarely begin with a single event. Instead, they build slowly, quietly, almost invisibly through rivalry, mistrust, competition, and pride. And today, many of those same warning signs are appearing again. Look at the relationships between major powers such as the United States, China, and Russia. These are not just ordinary countries. These are nations with immense military strength, vast economic influence, and global alliances. When tensions rise between such powers, the consequences do not stay limited to one region. They ripple across the entire planet. Over the last decade, we have witnessed a shift in the balance of power. The world is no longer dominated by a single superpower as it once was. Instead, multiple nations are asserting their influence, expanding their military capabilities, and seeking greater control over strategic regions. This competition is not always visible in dramatic headlines, but it is happening constantly. In diplomatic meetings, in economic policies, in military exercises, and even in the language leaders use when addressing one another. Consider how military presence around the world has grown. Nations are increasing defense budgets, developing advanced weapons systems, and conducting larger and more frequent military drills. These actions are often described as defensive measures. Each country claims it is simply protecting its interests, safeguarding its borders, and preparing for potential threats. But when every nation begins preparing for war at the same time, the world slowly becomes a more dangerous place. Another factor that fuels this tension is the struggle for influence over strategic regions. Powerful nations understand that controlling key areas, whether through military presence, economic investment, or political alliances, gives them an advantage on the global stage. As a result, competition grows not only between countries themselves, but also in the regions where their interests collide. Take the growing tension surrounding Taiwan. For some, it is a question of sovereignty and national unity. For others, it represents a commitment to defending democratic partners. For still others, it is a strategic location in global trade and technology supply chains. What makes this situation concerning is not simply the disagreement itself, but the involvement of powerful nations with strong militaries and firm political positions. When multiple powers stake their reputation and security on the same issue, the room for compromise becomes smaller. We see similar patterns of rivalry in different parts of the world. Diplomatic statements become sharper, sanctions are imposed, alliances are strengthened, military forces are repositioned. Each step might seem small when viewed individually, but together they form a larger picture of growing confrontation. There is also the powerful role of national pride and identity. Nations, like individuals, have memories. They remember past conflicts, past humiliations, and past victories. These memories shape how leaders and citizens interpret current events. When a country believes its honor, security, or global standing is being challenged, emotions can rise quickly, and when emotions enter international politics, decisions become harder to control. Another important element is mistrust. During times of cooperation, countries communicate openly and assume positive intentions from one another. But when trust begins to fade, every action is viewed through suspicion. A military exercise is no longer seen as routine. It becomes a threat. A technological advancement is not just progress. It becomes a potential weapon. A diplomatic alliance is interpreted as an attempt to isolate or weaken others. This cycle of suspicion creates what many experts call a security dilemma. One country increases its defenses to feel safer. Another country interprets that action as aggression and strengthens its own military response. The first country then feels threatened again and expands further. Step by step, both sides move closer to confrontation, even if neither originally intended to start a war. History reminds us that similar patterns existed before previous global conflicts. Before the outbreak of the World War I, powerful empires were locked in rivalries, forming alliances and expanding their militaries. Each believed it was acting defensively. Each believed it was protecting its interests. Yet those competing actions eventually created a situation where a single crisis triggered a massive global war. Today, the stakes are even higher. The world is more interconnected than ever before. Economies are linked, technologies spread instantly, and information travels across borders within seconds. This interconnectedness can bring cooperation and prosperity, but it also means that conflicts between major powers can escalate more rapidly and affect billions of people almost immediately. And this is why the rising tensions between global powers must be taken seriously. It is not about predicting an inevitable war. It is about recognizing the warning signs before they reach a point where leaders lose the ability to step back from the edge. Because when rivalry turns into hostility, when mistrust replaces dialogue, and when power becomes more important than peace, history shows us that the world begins moving down a very dangerous path. And ignoring these rising tensions between the worlds, most powerful nations may be one of the greatest mistakes humanity could make. Warning: when tensions rise between powerful nations, the danger does not always begin with those powers confronting each other directly. More often, the spark that ignites something much larger begins in regional conflicts, wars, and crises that appear local at first, but slowly pull global powers into their orbit. History has repeatedly shown us that regional disputes can transform into global catastrophes when alliances, rivalries, and strategic interests become entangled. If we look at the current state of the world, we see several regions where the stakes are already incredibly high. These conflicts are not isolated events happening far away from the rest of the world. They are deeply connected to global politics, military alliances, and economic competition. And when powerful nations become involved, directly or indirectly, the line between a regional war and a global confrontation becomes dangerously thin. Consider the ongoing conflict known as the Russia-Ukraine war. What began as a regional crisis quickly evolved into something far more complex. It is not simply a dispute between two neighboring countries. It has become a geopolitical struggle that involves military aid, economic sanctions, intelligence sharing, and strategic positioning from numerous countries across the globe. On one side, Russia views the conflict through the lens of security and influence in its surrounding region. On the other side, nations aligned with the Ukraine see the war as a critical moment for defending sovereignty and international law. Meanwhile, the United States and several European nations have provided extensive support to Ukraine, while implementing economic pressure on Russia. The result is a conflict that extends far beyond the battlefield. It has reshaped energy markets, strained diplomatic relations, and intensified military planning across Europe. More importantly, it has brought major powers into a prolonged confrontation where each decision carries global consequences. But this is not the only region where tensions are building. Across the world, another flashpoint continues to draw intense attention: the situation surrounding Taiwan. For China, Taiwan is viewed as a part of its national territory and a matter of historical unity. For Taiwan itself, maintaining its political autonomy is a central concern. And for the United States and its allies, the stability of the region and the security of partners play a significant role in their policies. This makes Taiwan one of the most sensitive geopolitical issues in the modern world. Military exercises, naval patrols, and political visits are all interpreted through the lens of strategic signaling. Every move is watched closely. Every statement carries weight. And while leaders often emphasize the importance of peace and stability, the reality remains that the potential for escalation exists. If such a conflict were ever to erupt, it would not remain confined to one island or one region. The surrounding waters are among the most important trade routes on the planet. Global supply chains, especially in technology and manufacturing, depend heavily on stability in this area. Any disruption would affect economies across continents, drawing in multiple nations whose interests are tied to the region. Then, there is the ongoing instability across the Middle East. For decades, this region has been a center of geopolitical tension, where local conflicts often intersect with the strategic interests of global powers. Wars, political rivalries, and security concerns create an environment where even a small incident can quickly escalate. Many nations maintain military presence, alliances, or strategic partnerships within the region. As a result, local disputes sometimes carry global implications. A confrontation between regional actors can easily pull larger powers into the situation through defense agreements, economic interests, or geopolitical influence. What makes these regional conflicts particularly dangerous is not simply the violence they produce. It is the network of alliances that surrounds them. Nations rarely stand alone. They have partners, treaties, and strategic relationships that shape how they respond to crises. When one country becomes involved in a conflict, its allies may feel obligated to provide support. Another power, seeing this support as a threat to its own interests, may respond in turn. Gradually, more and more nations become entangled in a situation that none of them originally intended to expand. This is how regional conflicts become global confrontations. We have seen this pattern before in history. The assassination of an archduke in 1914 was not, by itself, a world-changing event. Yet, the alliances and rivalries surrounding that incident eventually triggered the massive conflict known as World War I. What began as a regional crisis quickly spread across continents because nations felt compelled to defend their allies and protect their strategic positions. The lesson from history is clear. Wars do not always grow because leaders seek global destruction. Sometimes they grow because each side believes it has no choice but to respond. And in today's world, where military technology is far more advanced and communication moves at lightning speed, the risks of miscalculation are even greater. A single incident, a misunderstood military maneuver, an accidental strike, a misinterpreted signal, could trigger reactions that spiral beyond control. That is why regional conflicts must never be dismissed as distant or irrelevant. They are often the first tremors before a much larger earthquake. They reveal the underlying tensions between powerful nations and expose the fragile balance that holds the international system together. When we observe the conflicts unfolding in places like Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East, we are not just witnessing isolated struggles. We are seeing the fault lines of global power competition, where the interests of major nations intersect in ways that could reshape the future of the world. And history warns us that when regional conflicts begin pulling powerful nations toward opposing sides, the world moves one step closer to a confrontation that no one truly wants, but one that becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. Warning, as we continue to reflect on the warning signs that the world cannot afford to ignore, we come to perhaps the most frightening element of modern conflict, the existence of nuclear weapons. In earlier centuries, wars were devastating, but they were still limited by the technology of their time. Battles were fought with armies, with ships, with artillery. Even the most destructive wars still left much of humanity able to rebuild and recover. But the world changed forever in the 20th century, when nuclear weapons entered the stage. The moment the world witnessed the devastation of atomic warfare during the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, humanity crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. These bombs were not just larger explosives. They were weapons capable of destroying entire cities in moments, leaving behind not only physical destruction but also long-lasting radiation that could affect generations. Since that time, nuclear technology has advanced dramatically. What once required a massive aircraft and a single bomb has now evolved into weapons that are far more powerful, far more precise, and far more numerous. Today, several nations possess nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization many times over. Among the countries known to possess significant nuclear capabilities are the United States and Russia, both of which inherited vast stockpiles during the tense years of the Cold War. These two powers alone control thousands of nuclear warheads, many of them ready to be launched within minutes if a crisis were to escalate. But nuclear weapons are not limited to those two nations. Other states such as China, North Korea, and several others also maintain nuclear programs. Each of these weapons exists within a delicate balance of deterrence, a system built on the idea that no country will launch a nuclear attack because it knows the retaliation would be equally devastating. This concept, often described as mutually assured destruction, has paradoxically helped prevent nuclear war for decades. The logic is simple but terrifying. If one side launches, the other side launches in response, and both suffer catastrophic destruction. Because the consequences are so unthinkable, leaders are expected to avoid crossing that line. Yet the existence of these weapons also means that every major conflict carries an unimaginable risk. When tensions rise between nuclear-armed states, the stakes become far greater than territory or political influence. The stakes become the survival of millions of people and the stability of the planet itself. Think about the power contained in a single modern nuclear warhead. Experts often explain that many of today's nuclear weapons are dozens of times more powerful than the bombs dropped in 1945. A single detonation over a large city could result in massive destruction, widespread fires, radiation exposure, and the collapse of infrastructure. Hospitals would be overwhelmed. Communication systems would fail. Entire communities could disappear within moments. And if multiple weapons were used, the consequences would not remain confined to one region. Scientists have long warned that a large-scale nuclear exchange could trigger environmental effects that spread across the globe. Smoke and debris rising into the atmosphere could block sunlight, lower global temperatures, and disrupt agriculture on a massive scale. Food shortages, economic collapse, and humanitarian crises could follow. This is why nuclear weapons represent the ultimate threat in any discussion about global conflict. But the danger does not lie only in deliberate attacks. Another terrifying possibility is miscalculation. Throughout history, there have been moments when false alarms, technological errors, or misinterpreted data nearly triggered nuclear responses. In those tense moments, decisions had to be made in minutes, sometimes even seconds. Imagine the pressure on leaders and military commanders during such crises. They must decide whether an incoming signal represents a real attack or a mistake. They must evaluate incomplete information while knowing that hesitation could leave their country vulnerable. The system is designed for rapid response, but that very speed also increases the risk of catastrophic errors. Then there is the growing concern of nuclear proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons technology to additional countries. Every new nuclear state adds another layer of complexity to global security. Each nation has its own strategic interests, political pressures, and security concerns. The more actors that possess such weapons, the harder it becomes to maintain stability. In addition, modern technology has introduced new dimensions to nuclear strategy. Cyber capabilities raise questions about whether communication systems, warning networks, or command structures could be disrupted during a crisis. If a nation suddenly loses access to its early warning systems, how might its leaders interpret that situation? Would they assume a technical failure, or would they suspect an incoming attack? These uncertainties create an environment where misunderstandings can become extremely dangerous. At the same time, geopolitical tensions around the world continue to increase. As we discussed earlier, conflicts involving major powers are already shaping global politics. When those powers also possess nuclear arsenals, every confrontation becomes more delicate. Every diplomatic failure becomes more serious. This is why discussions about nuclear weapons are not simply about military strength. They are about responsibility, restraint, and the recognition that some lines once crossed cannot be undone. The destructive potential of these weapons forces humanity to confront a sobering truth. Our technological power has advanced far beyond our ability to control every possible outcome. And so the presence of nuclear weapons serves as both a warning and a reminder of how quickly a major conflict could escalate beyond imagination, and a reminder that the choices made by nations today carry consequences for generations that have not yet been born. Because in a world armed with nuclear weapons, the difference between tension and catastrophe can sometimes be measured in only a few irreversible decisions. Radioactive. When many people imagine war, their minds immediately picture tanks rolling across borders, fighter jets roaring through the sky, and soldiers facing each other on battlefields. That image comes from the wars of the past, where conflicts were fought with visible weapons and physical armies. But the nature of warfare is changing, and one of the most important warnings we cannot ignore is that modern conflict is no longer limited to land, sea, and air. A new battlefield has emerged, one that exists in the invisible world of technology, networks, and information. Today, wars can begin long before a single missile is launched. They can start silently through cyber attacks, digital sabotage, and technological disruption. Nations are increasingly investing in cyber warfare capabilities, recognizing that modern societies depend heavily on digital systems for almost everything: communication, banking, transportation, electricity, healthcare, and even national defense. Imagine for a moment what would happen if a country suddenly lost access to its power grid. Cities would go dark, hospitals would struggle to function, transportation systems would stop, financial markets could collapse within hours. Now imagine that such a disruption was not caused by a natural disaster, but by a deliberate cyber attack launched from thousands of miles away. No tanks would be visible, no planes would be flying overhead, yet the damage to the nation's stability could be enormous. This is why cyber warfare has become such a serious concern among global powers like the United States, China, and Russia. These nations understand that controlling the digital battlefield may become just as important as controlling territory. Intelligence agencies and military organizations now include entire divisions dedicated to cyber operations, teams of experts working to defend their own networks, while also developing the ability to penetrate those of potential rivals. Cyber warfare creates a new kind of uncertainty because attacks can be difficult to trace. When a missile is launched, its origin can often be identified quickly. But when a cyber attack occurs, determining who is responsible can take time and may never be completely certain. Hackers may disguise their location, route their actions through multiple countries, or use sophisticated methods to hide their identity. This ambiguity can create dangerous misunderstandings. If a country experiences a large-scale cyber disruption, it may suspect another nation of being responsible even if the evidence is incomplete. In a tense geopolitical environment, that suspicion alone could provoke retaliation, escalating tensions further. Another dimension of modern warfare involves the protection and control of satellites in space. Much of the world's communication, navigation, and surveillance systems depend on satellites orbiting the Earth. These satellites guide airplanes, enable GPS navigation, transmit television broadcasts, and support military coordination. If those satellites were disabled or destroyed, the effects would be felt across the entire global infrastructure. Because of this dependence, space has quietly become another strategic arena. Nations are developing technologies designed to protect their own satellites and, in some cases, potentially disrupt those of others. What once seemed like science fiction is now part of real military planning. And then there is the rapid development of artificial intelligence. AI is transforming nearly every industry, and military systems are no exception. Artificial intelligence can analyze enormous amounts of data at incredible speed, helping militaries detect threats, coordinate operations, and guide advanced weapons systems. For example, AI-driven systems can analyze satellite imagery to identify troop movements or unusual activity. Autonomous drones can operate with increasing independence, performing reconnaissance or even engaging targets. Missile defense systems may rely on algorithms to detect and respond to incoming threats within seconds. While these technologies can enhance defensive capabilities, they also introduce new risks. When machines begin making decisions at high speed, the margin for human oversight becomes smaller. If an AI system misinterprets data or reacts to a false signal, the consequences could escalate rapidly before human leaders have time to intervene. Another concern is the possibility of an arms race in emerging technologies. During the Cold War, nations competed to build larger nuclear arsenals. Today, the competition may increasingly focus on technological superiority, who can develop faster computing systems, more advanced cyber capabilities, and more sophisticated autonomous weapons. This technological race is fueled by the belief that falling behind could leave a nation vulnerable. If one country develops a powerful cyber capability, others feel pressure to develop similar or stronger capabilities in response. The result is a cycle of rapid innovation driven by fear of being outmatched. Yet the faster technology evolves, the harder it becomes to create international agreements that regulate its use. Traditional arms control treaties focused on physical weapons, missiles, warheads, and military equipment. Cyber tools and AI systems are far more difficult to monitor and regulate. They can be developed secretly, deployed remotely, and modified quickly. This creates a world where conflict might unfold in ways that ordinary citizens barely notice until the consequences appear. A cyber intrusion might quietly disrupt communication networks. A digital sabotage could slow down financial systems. An information attack could manipulate public opinion by spreading false narratives across social media platforms. In this environment, warfare is no longer confined to battlefields. It can influence elections, destabilize economies, and weaken public trust in institutions. The battlefield extends into the very systems that modern societies depend upon every day. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all is that many of these attacks can occur during peacetime, in the gray space between war and peace. Countries may test each other's defenses, probe vulnerabilities, and conduct limited operations without openly declaring conflict. This constant digital tension creates a fragile balance. nations must defend themselves while trying to avoid actions that could trigger larger confrontations. The line between competition and conflict becomes increasingly blurred. So when we talk about the warning signs of a potential global crisis, we cannot focus only on traditional weapons. We must also recognize that modern warfare is evolving in ways that are faster, quieter, and often harder to control. Because in the digital age, the next major conflict might not begin with the sound of explosions. It may begin with a silent attack on the systems that hold the modern world together. Warning: as we continue reflecting on the warning signs shaping our world today, we must recognize that conflict does not always begin with bombs or bullets. Sometimes the struggle for power unfolds through economic pressure, financial influence, and global alliances. Nations compete not only on battlefields, but also in markets, trade agreements, and international partnerships. And in many ways, these economic rivalries can quietly deepen divisions long before any military confrontation occurs. The modern global economy is deeply interconnected. Goods move across continents, financial markets react instantly to political events, and supply chains stretch across dozens of countries. On the surface, this interconnectedness seems like a powerful force for peace. After all, when economies depend on each other, nations have strong incentives to maintain stability. Yet this same interconnected system can also become a tool of strategic competition. In recent years, we have seen increasing examples of what many analysts call economic warfare. Instead of direct military confrontation, nations use tariffs, trade restrictions, financial sanctions, and control over resources to pressure their rivals. These actions may appear less dramatic than military strikes, but their impact can be enormous. For example, when powerful economies impose sanctions, entire sectors of a country's economy can be affected. Access to global banking systems may be restricted. International trade can slow dramatically. Key industries may struggle to obtain the technology or materials they need. These economic pressures can reshape political decisions, influence domestic stability, and deepen geopolitical tensions. A clear example of this dynamic has appeared in the relationship between the United States and China. Over the past decade, competition between these two global powers has increasingly extended into trade policies, technology restrictions, and strategic industries. Both countries recognize that economic strength plays a central role in national power, and each seeks to maintain its advantage in critical sectors such as manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and advanced technology. This rivalry has led to tariffs, investment restrictions, and efforts to reduce dependence on each other's supply chains. While these actions are often described as defensive measures designed to protect national interests, they also reflect a broader struggle for influence within the global economic system. Another powerful tool in economic competition is the control of strategic resources. Throughout history, access to resources such as oil, rare minerals, and energy supplies has shaped international relations. Countries that control these resources often gain leverage in global negotiations, while those that depend heavily on imports may find themselves vulnerable during periods of tension. Energy politics, in particular, has played a major role in shaping alliances and rivalries. Nations that supply energy to others can influence markets and political decisions, while those that rely on imported energy must carefully manage their relationships with suppliers. This interdependence can create both cooperation and conflict. At the same time, global alliances continue to shape how nations position themselves in the world. Military alliances are often supported by economic partnerships, trade agreements, and diplomatic cooperation. These alliances create networks of support, but they can also deepen divisions between competing blocs. One of the most well-known alliances in the world today is NATO. a military and political partnership that includes many countries across Europe and North America. Originally formed during the early years of the Cold War, this alliance was designed to provide collective security, meaning that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. Over time, NATO has evolved and expanded, but its core principle of collective defense remains central to its identity. For its members, the alliance provides security and cooperation. For some other nations, however, its expansion and activities are viewed with suspicion or concern, adding another layer of geopolitical tension. At the same time, alternative economic and political groupings have begun to grow in influence. Organizations such as BRICS, which includes several major emerging economies, aim to strengthen cooperation among developing nations and create new financial frameworks that reduce dependence on traditional Western institutions. These developments reflect a broader transformation in the global balance of power. The international system that emerged after the Second World War is gradually evolving as new economic centers rise and different regions seek greater influence in global decision-making. While competition between alliances and economic blocs is not necessarily dangerous on its own, it can become problematic when mistrust grows and cooperation declines. If nations begin viewing global politics as a zero-sum game, where one side's gain must come at another's loss, then collaboration becomes much more difficult. Economic pressure can also trigger political reactions within countries. When sanctions disrupt industries or trade conflicts affect jobs and prices, domestic populations may demand stronger responses from their governments. Leaders facing such pressure may adopt more aggressive policies to demonstrate strength and defend national interests. This is how economic competition can gradually harden into geopolitical confrontation. And when economic divisions align with military alliances and political rivalries, the world can begin to split into competing spheres of influence. Trade flows may shift, diplomatic relationships may become more rigid, and the possibility of compromise may shrink. History has shown us that economic tensions have often preceded major conflicts. Before the outbreak of the World War II, global trade disruptions, protectionist policies, and economic rivalries contributed to an atmosphere of instability and resentment among nations. Today's world is more complex and interconnected than ever before, which means the consequences of economic conflict could spread even faster. A financial crisis in one region can ripple across global markets within hours. Trade disputes can disrupt industries across continents. Economic sanctions can reshape international relationships for decades. All of these factors remind us that the struggle for global influence does not happen only through military power. It also unfolds through economic systems, financial networks, and strategic partnerships. And when economic competition begins to divide the world into rival blocs rather than encouraging cooperation, it becomes another powerful warning sign that the foundations of global stability may be starting to crack. Warning as we reflect on all these warning signs, the rising tensions between powerful nations, the regional conflicts that could expand, the terrifying reality of nuclear weapons, the new battlefield of cyber warfare, and the growing divisions in the global economy, we may begin to feel a sense of unease. The picture can seem overwhelming. The forces shaping the world today are complex, powerful, and sometimes deeply unpredictable. Yet, even in the midst of these challenges, there remains something incredibly important that humanity must not lose sight of: the power of diplomacy and cooperation. Throughout history, the same world that has witnessed devastating wars has also witnessed remarkable moments of peacebuilding, negotiation, and reconciliation. Nations do not always have to move toward conflict. They can choose dialogue. They can choose restraint. They can choose cooperation over confrontation. Diplomacy may not always capture headlines the way military actions do, but it remains one of the most essential tools for maintaining global stability. Behind closed doors, diplomats spend countless hours negotiating agreements, managing disputes, and trying to prevent misunderstandings from escalating into crises. Sometimes diplomacy means finding compromises that satisfy no one completely, yet prevent disaster. At other times, it means maintaining communication, even between rivals who deeply distrust each other. These conversations can be slow, frustrating, and complicated, but they serve an incredibly important purpose. They keep the door open for peaceful solutions. One of the key institutions created to support international dialogue is the United Nations. Established in the aftermath of the World War II, this organization was designed with a simple but powerful mission: to help nations resolve conflicts through discussion rather than warfare. The founders of the United Nations understood something deeply important. They had witnessed a world devastated by two massive global wars within a single generation. They knew that without a place where nations could communicate, negotiate, and address grievances, the cycle of conflict could repeat itself again and again. Today, the United Nations provides a platform where countries can raise concerns, debate policies, and seek diplomatic solutions. While the organization is far from perfect and often criticized for its limitations, it still plays a crucial role in facilitating international dialogue. Peacekeeping missions, humanitarian assistance, and conflict mediation efforts all reflect attempts to manage global tensions before they spiral out of control. Diplomacy also occurs outside of large international institutions. Countries frequently engage in direct negotiations, bilateral agreements, and regional cooperation frameworks. These efforts help manage disputes over borders, trade, security, and resources. One important lesson from history is that even the most intense rivalries can sometimes be eased through sustained communication. During the long years of the Cold War, the world stood under the constant shadow of nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. The tensions were enormous, and the ideological divide seemed almost impossible to bridge. Yet despite that hostility, both sides eventually recognized the catastrophic risk of direct conflict. Over time, they established communication channels, negotiated arms control agreements, and created mechanisms designed to reduce the likelihood of accidental war. These diplomatic efforts did not eliminate rivalry, but they helped prevent it from turning into nuclear catastrophe. This example reminds us that diplomacy does not require nations to become friends overnight. It simply requires them to recognize the consequences of failing to communicate. In our modern world, diplomacy has become even more important because global challenges are increasingly shared across borders. Issues like climate change, economic instability, pandemics, and technological development cannot be managed by any single country alone. They require cooperation among nations with different cultures, political systems, and priorities. When cooperation weakens, these challenges become far harder to address. But when nations work together even imperfectly, they can build frameworks that reduce risk and promote stability. Another essential aspect of peacebuilding is the role of public awareness. Citizens around the world influence the direction of their societies through public opinion, civic engagement, and democratic participation. When populations demand peaceful solutions and responsible leadership, governments are more likely to pursue diplomacy rather than confrontation. At the same time, leaders carry enormous responsibility. Decisions made in moments of crisis can shape the course of history. A single misjudgment, a refusal to negotiate, or an unwillingness to listen can escalate tensions in ways that are difficult to reverse. But the opposite is also true. A courageous decision to pursue dialogue, to reduce hostility, or to compromise for the sake of stability can change the direction of events in powerful ways. It is easy, when looking at the complexities of global politics, to assume that ordinary people have little influence over these forces. Yet history shows that public pressure, moral leadership, and international cooperation can reshape the course of nations. Peace is not simply the absence of war. It is the result of constant effort to build trust, resolve disputes, and create systems that encourage cooperation instead of conflict. In a world where nuclear weapons exist, where cyber technology can disrupt entire societies, and where powerful nations compete for influence, diplomacy is not a luxury. It is a necessity, and as we look at the warning signs unfolding around us today, we must remember that the future is not predetermined. The choices made by nations, leaders, and societies will determine whether rising tensions lead to greater cooperation or deeper division. Because in the end, the greatest safeguard against global catastrophe is the simple but powerful decision of humanity to choose dialogue over destruction. Globe showing Europe, Africa,